Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everyone is enjoying their weekend and the day's events so far. So for today's session, open-minded collaboration scale, this will be focusing on identifying best practices in regards to communication in software documentation within your team and also between your company and its users. Now I would like to introduce our special guest speaker today, Ashley Newton. Ashley is a technical writer with extensive experience in software documentation and front-end web development. In addition to her work as a tech writer, Ashley has recently founded her second Write the Docs chapter, a global organization that promotes best practices in software documentation, this time right here in Windsor, Detroit. During the presentation, please post any questions that you may have in the chat, as there will be a short Q&A period at the conclusion of the session. Ashley, the floor is now yours.
And thanks everyone for joining us today. Some of the common themes of this conference so far are different frameworks like Flutter, cybersecurity, and AI. And what I'd like to do is take a step back and talk about what we're all ultimately doing and trying to do here, which is problem solving. We're innovating, and on a higher level, we're doing this by transferring knowledge. Good documentation is key to transferring crucial knowledge to make sure that no one gets left behind. In my experience as a technical writer, I've looked to open source solutions to communicate better and to collaborate better. Relying heavily on not just open source tools, but also on the spirit of open source. And this includes open idea sharing, open communities, and being open to new people contributing to my documentation. So why documentation? Well, because it makes life easier for you, your team, and your users. When you have a great idea and you're building something that solves a problem, it's tempting to just barrel ahead and keep building until you have a finished product. This is the beauty of innovation and the creative process. So let's say you start building your app and maybe you create an MVP, but then you stop to think, well, wait, wouldn't this be better if I added more features or if I changed a few things? And wouldn't it be great if I had the bandwidth to fix some bugs? So documentation is helpful for internal contributors. We start to realize that to make our solutions better, we need to bring on new people. If you're working in the open source world, you might bring on new contributors by putting your project on GitHub. Or if you're working on a proprietary software, you might hire additional developers. But if you want newcomers to be effective, you need to get them up to speed. And how do you onboard them? Well, you could walk them through each and every detail of the project yourself, but a more scalable option would be to speed things up through documentation. That way you don't have to show them everything manually or even rely that much on your own memory. If you document your project, this vastly increases the time to productivity for new contributors, and it improves the experience for both them and for you. Project docs help new contributors understand all kinds of things that they need to know to be effective. This could be things like a description of the application you're building. You might provide tutorials where they can learn more about the subject matter or the industry. You could provide resources to help them install dependencies and set up a developer environment. And it might also include design requirements for new features. Your entire team can work more effectively when they have access to docs that demonstrate clearly what they're building and why. Documentation is also very important for users. It helps your users succeed. And this is critical to effective user onboarding. UX copy can be embedded directly in the application, for example, in the form of tooltips and pop-ups, and this can help users interact seamlessly with your software. And while UX design plays a big role, it doesn't cover everything. According to App Queues, user onboarding is the #1 thing that you can do to retain new users. And by providing quality documentation, you're going to be able to transfer your expert knowledge to users so they can solve real-world problems by using your software. But creating documentation that's useful and up to date is much easier said than done. Especially in the world of tech, everything changes rapidly. I think I speak for all of us when I say that sometimes if I take a week off, it feels like I've missed out on 6 months worth of work by the time I come back. So it's a constant race to keep up with the latest advances, and this is something that we're all familiar with and something that we've all come to accept. It's also interesting because it even affects our users and the way that they consume our products. According to research by Nielsen Norman Group using eye tracking technology, they found that even the way that we read has changed vastly over the last 10 years. Another challenge to documentation is the fact that design is messy and project management is non-linear. So if we're thinking not even about the state of software development at large, if we're looking just within your own team, you might have lots of change and churn all the time. If we were all using the waterfall method, writing documentation would be relatively simple. We would plan our upcoming features and document them. Everything would go according to plan, and by the time we released, the docs would have been written, tested, and ready to go before the dev work even started. But for teams using design thinking, agile, or many other modern methodologies, the development process is much more complex. Rather than a nice, clean, linear shape, we see a loop. Or frankly, sometimes it's something more like a bunch of scribbles. So let's say we document a new feature here in the early stage of development, and a while later, after getting to work on it and iterating on the initial design, the documentation has already become outdated before the feature is even released. So transferring knowledge is tough when the knowledge itself is in constant flux. You might also feel the pain a little by little over time as your project grows and you continue to add new people to your team. Often projects become more complex as you adopt new tools, processes, and workarounds. And this can make it harder for newcomers to find an entry point to begin contributing. In a very complex system, it can also mean that introducing one feature has a cascading effect that breaks a handful of other features. A growing team or a project can also lead to knowledge silos. As your team grows larger, it can typically break into smaller sub-teams so that each team can focus more effectively on solving a smaller set of problems. But then the challenge is that all of the squiggly lines you saw before, take that and multiply it by the number of teams. And this creates a greater challenge of creating alignment across all of those teams and making sure everyone knows what they're working on and why. This is a particular challenge in large open source projects. By nature, open source contributors have an incentive to focus on coding. So if you don't state documentation requirements and bake them into the code review process, it's easy for the documentation debt to ramp up quickly. So what can you do about it? How can we make sure that while we innovate, we don't forget to communicate? How can we make sure that knowledge gets transferred across your team and makes it to your users to help them succeed? This is where being open-minded comes in. According to the book, The Product is Docs, being an open-minded creator of documentation means three things. One, you recognize that the value in the document is the transfer of knowledge, and you value that rather than getting hung up on minute details of grammar and style. Two, you encourage contributions from many different sources, since this is the best way to gather the most knowledge. And three, you embrace the open source way. So what is the open source way? Well, according to opensource.com, the open source way is a broader set of values that goes beyond just open source computer programs. It involves projects, products, or initiatives that embrace and celebrate principles of open exchange, collaborative participation, rapid prototyping, transparency, meritocracy, and community-oriented development. And with that in mind, let me walk you through some resources that can help solve your documentation challenges and introduce more open-mindedness to them. So first, there are some online communities that I've found very helpful. Write the Docs is a global community of conferences and meetups dedicated to best practices in software documentation, and it tends to have a focus on open source. We just barely launched a new chapter here, actually. It's called Write the Docs Detroit Windsor, so please join us. Even if you're not local, you can still join us because all of our meetings are remote right now, and participation is free. We welcome new people as much as possible, since the more people that get involved, the more we can all learn. We also have a Write the Docs Slack community, and again, this is very welcoming and a wealth of knowledge about everything software documentation. If you ever have any questions about a documentation challenge, I highly recommend searching the website or asking in Slack. Another great community is the Good Docs project. This is an open source project dedicated to best practices templates and writing instructions for documenting open source software. They provide resources that you can start using right away to create the minimum viable docs for whatever project you're working on. And this is really great if you are at the point where you know you need better docs, but you just aren't sure where to start. And I personally find templates very helpful. I find that it's just nice to work with something with some sort of existing structure rather than starting with a blank page. And they might also introduce standards kind of in line with industry standards that would give you an edge over your competitors. So that's another benefit. Another thing that you can do to improve your documentation is to distribute knowledge. So ultimately, that's what we're looking to do. The fundamental problem is that as you're working on a team and the team keeps growing, those teams break into smaller teams, knowledge becomes fragmented, and silos form. So in line with the open source way, again, open exchange, collaboration, and community, how do we pinpoint where those silos are and why? In my experience, I've had lots of success with process mapping, which might look something like this. So you take some sort of process in your organization and you map it in the form of a flowchart. On my team, we mapped two different processes that I found very helpful. One was the journey that users followed when they were using our site, and the other was the journey that technical writers followed when we worked behind the scenes to publish content on the site. Through this process mapping, we were able to quickly identify some major pain points and also see where knowledge transfer was failing. And it was also clear where we needed to refine and scale our processes. Process mapping is a great way to get a visual picture of your processes, whether they be code reviews, feature enhancement requests, or handover of customer information between teams. And this can give you a clear view of where there are inefficient or outdated ways of working and what improvements are needed. Another thing that I've found very helpful is testing the docs. Nowadays, this can actually be pretty simple because participants can just hop on a Zoom call. You just need to provide them with a copy of your documentation as well as a demo environment where they can test your software. And what I did in the past was I would have participants read my documentation out loud to see if it made sense. And this helped me very quickly identify weaknesses in the docs. So I knew where knowledge transfer was failing and how to fix it. Another testing measure I've found helpful is distributing surveys. You can distribute the survey either to users or even internally to other colleagues, asking for feedback on your documentation and asking them to make suggestions on areas that need improvement. And what I also did in the past was I would redistribute the survey every so often, like once a quarter or once every 4 months, to gauge whether the doc quality was improving. And it was also a great conversation starter. There were just things that people suggested that I document that I didn't think about myself. They just weren't on my radar. So it's a great way to just kind of get the conversation going and get those suggestions coming in so you can figure out where knowledge leaks are happening. So another way to improve your documentation is to reduce the barrier to entry for new contributors. Because again, when knowledge is distributed, and fragmented across different people and different teams. It's important to have some sort of place where people can write documentation and transfer their knowledge to others. So this could be in the form of something like a forum or a wiki or a knowledge base. On certain teams, maybe even just on Slack works. There are any number of different tools out there that you can use. And when you choose your knowledge management tools, make sure you get input from stakeholders and see what tools they're comfortable using. I've run into challenges in the past when I required people to use a tool or a process that was too complex. This is also a common challenge that prevents newcomers from contributing to open source. So it's important to keep tools and processes simple to reduce the barrier to entry for new contributors. All right, so far we've talked a lot about the open source way, which again includes collaborating and being transparent. And we've talked about the benefits of this, such as more scalable and open systems, being able to keep up with the fast pace of technology, being able to collect a larger volume of better ideas, and getting a more realistic understanding of user needs and how your product matches up. But what about the costs? Well, let's consider what some of those might be and how to mitigate them. So one potential cost of open communication is that there could be some risk of compromised quality if new contributors cut corners in their writing. But again, this is where open-mindedness comes into play. So to a certain extent, if we want to welcome new contributors, we need to be a little more flexible about writing standards, because we're ultimately focused on getting more knowledge transfer, and we want to encourage that. Another potential cost, depending on the situation, is that there might be some risk of abuse. This is just kind of inherent in online communities. This is an inherent risk, so you need to have measures in place to prevent abuse. This could be a code of conduct and having designated moderators. There is also online, unfortunately, there's some risk of misinformation. So you need to have a review process in place. Like, for example, if you have a wiki where anyone can contribute, you might have alerts set up so that every article or every page needs to be reviewed, let's say every month or every 3 months or something, just depending on the needs of your project. So those are some of the pros and cons that come with open-minded collaboration. And I mean, with all of this said, I will also give you this, that there are some topics in life that are too sensitive to open source or to make transparent. For example, there are lots of Facebook groups out there nowadays. Like there are some parenting groups where parents can go and ask other parents for tips and tricks. This type of community might be great for some parents, but it might feel like it's just too sensitive for other parents to discuss in an open and transparent way. So it's just important to use your own judgment in deciding when to apply these principles and what's comfortable for you and for your community. Or also, one thing that I think of is I don't know if anyone here has read the book The Circle by Dave Eggers, but in that book, there's a practice that he calls going transparent, where a person agrees to wear a body cam with a speaker 24/7. And they had politicians do this, for example. I'm certainly not advocating for all of us to go transparent, at least not in that way that he portrayed. So again, it's important when choosing where to apply these principles, just to use judgment, deciding where to use them. In my experience, I've found that my work, not just as a technical writer, but as a tech professional in general, has been so much better the more I've embraced open-minded collaboration practices. And this has also helped increase satisfaction, both from my users and from the people that I work with. And I think that each and every person attending this conference has so much talent and skill and potential. And so just think, whatever your goals are, if you could amplify your skills by sharing your work with others, and not just sharing it, but also sharing it in a way that's effective and that builds community, just think how much more you could create. Thank you for joining me today. My slides will be available later, and they have links to some of the resources that I've mentioned. And also, if you're looking for any other resources that aren't in the slides, please contact me.
Oh, thanks, Ashley. That was a great session, and even for me as somebody without that technical background, which I know that that you're aiming towards, I thought that was great. Just being able to understand, right, how everyone has to work together within a company, and how, especially for new hires, how having that documentation in place, right, it streamlines the process, improves efficiencies, and it just reduces the time that maybe other employees would need to help that employee to get them up to speed and everything. So for me, I thought that was really great. So let's see, the first question we have in here. I have been a tech writer before, didn't enjoy it then, and I don't now. I know documenting is important, but just can't get myself to do it, and most of the time I forget to do it. Do you have any tips on how to remember to document stuff so documenting and developing can go hand in hand?
Yes, so there are two particular techniques come to mind. One would be templates and checklists, and the other is using tools to set reminders. So so like, for example, if you're using GitLab or GitHub, you can go in and you can modify your merge request templates so that there's a checkbox to document the feature, for instance. And so that'll make sure that's like baking it into the code review process to make sure that whoever's reviewing your code has to also check and see if you've written docs for the feature. So that's one thing that I find very helpful. And yeah, another option is to use templates. So maybe like whenever you do have to write docs, which you might not want to do, but once you see it on the checklist and you know that you have to provide docs, to have a template available so that it just kind of gets the ball rolling. Has a general document structure, like here's an overview, here's how to use it, here are like information fields you might need to know the values for. So yeah, the Good Docs project specifically has templates available that are very helpful. I would definitely recommend looking at those. And then the other thing is that if you're not like doing this in the context of merging code, one other thing that I've found helpful working with a content management system is you can, depending on the system, you might be able to set a timer for each article or each page. We set it up so that every 2 to 3 months you would get emails harassing us and telling us we had to update the page or review it to see if it was still relevant. And well, getting emailed constantly is annoying, so definitely helped us keep things up to date. So I found both of those things very helpful.
Next question we have, you talked about user testing docs. What are the major challenges you encountered and how did you overcome them?
Thank you. Well, let's see, major challenges for testing docs. I guess one of the biggest challenges I ran into was providing a testing environment that my testers could use. Since I was the person that sort of spearheaded this UX testing project, I had to take it upon myself to use things like AWS to spin up servers and also get the IP address of the machines that the participants were using and add them to a security list and get them the information that they needed to SSH into the server. So there were some technical skills that I actually had to pick up in order to make this user testing possible. And then it was also kind of difficult to just get buy-in or on an organizational level. Sometimes when you're spearheading a new project, you have to kind of sell the executives on the idea and say say like, this is worth pursuing, this is worth doing. So there was a little bit of that too, but I think as soon as we started, it became very clear very quickly, like this was extremely valuable. We definitely want to keep doing it.
Great answer for sure. And I think Jackie was just wondering about the name of the org with the octopus logo.
Yes, I know. When I saw that too, I thought, well, this is their logo, but it doesn't say what, it doesn't say the name of the community. So yeah, I can definitely tell you it's the Good Docs project. But that yeah, that octopus is what they call the doctopus. So that's the story there.
Then from Jason, are there many organizations that use workbooks like Jupyter notebooks in lieu of traditional documentation?
I guess I'm not really familiar with what a workbook is, but I'm guessing it might be something more like a content management system or a wiki. Does that sound about right, Jason? Well, in lieu of more information, I will just say there are all different kinds of documentation out there, and the type of documentation that you use will just be okay. So more of like an interactive documentation. I mean, I think they're definitely out there, and one thing that I saw recently that I thought was really cool was that I was looking at the Google API documentation, and they had a little widget built in where you could test an API call. I thought that seemed really cool. There are definitely things like that out there where you can you can make your documentation really sophisticated and really elegant. In my experience, it also requires quite a bit of development work just to create the documentation. So while that's definitely an option, it might be relatively resource intensive. And so that's another thing that sometimes just getting the resources to create something like that requires a certain amount of buy-in from leadership. So, but yeah, I think that sort of thing is growing. So we're gonna see more and more of that over time. Yeah, that was a good question. Thank you. I'm gonna look into that more now.
Any other questions? I guess I have a question then. Let's say hypothetically speaking, you join an org or you belong in an org that doesn't have this document. It's everything that you don't want it to be, right? It's fragmented, it's siloed and everything. Let's say that person is a go-getter, right? Someone that really wants to change the organization. What do you think would be the first steps that they should do or implement in order to change the company as a whole for the better?
Well, there are a few things we could potentially do. One is that one thing that I've found in my experience and in my research is that with certain initiatives like this, it's important to have an owner of the initiative, because what is very likely the case is that there are probably just lots of different people already working at the organization who are frustrated by the lack of docs. And whenever they want to provide feedback on the docs or they want to make a request for the docs, they simply don't know who to talk to. If you can become the owner of that, then that at least gets you to the point where that the requests and the feedback actually have a funnel so that they can be processed or they can be stored or archived in some way so that someone can actually do something with them. Even if you start out and it's like very scrappy and I mean, I can't tell you how many times someone's given me feedback and I've said, that's great feedback. I completely agree. I do not have the bandwidth to work on it right now, but I will definitely add it to the backlog. Even if sometimes you have to just do that, at least you're now creating that funnel for the feedback, so something can happen with it eventually. And then again, back to the issue of buy-in from leadership. I've found that if you want to take this on and become the owner, but you're not sure if you're going to get that buy-in, it's really helpful if you can create like a mini proof of concept and show it to the executive team or to your direct supervisor, just to say like, look, this is what it could be. I was already able to create this and get it going. All I need is just more resources to grow it. It's good to come to them with something rather than just saying like, I have a problem and I want to do something, say like, I've already started doing something about it. So that's a way to get the ball rolling and hopefully keep it going. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And I think that's great for everyone in here who is listening, even if it's outside of dealing with fragmented knowledge. I think anyone who's interested with a new product or anything like that, I think that's excellent first steps. So from Chris, any particular thoughts on situations where the developer has seen the subject matter experts cycle out of the org to the extent where the dev is now the most knowledgeable person on how to do the process and what its constraints are? It's weird when an outsourced dev has become the vessel of institutional knowledge.
That's true, and I have definitely seen that happen. That's one of those things where people, as a technical writer, people come to me and report to me that this sort of thing is happening, and I often just say like, I empathize with you, but I'm just not the person to address this. So that's like kind of what I would say. I mean, I think with any other time I'm up against some sort of problem that is documentation and knowledge transfer related, but it's just something that like I personally don't feel like I have power to change. There could be some progress made if you were to address, like bring a request to the leadership team, figure out exactly what your ask is and go to your direct supervisor. And then another thing that I've done at times, like if I'm working with a team and I really, really need collaboration with the other team, and just for whatever reason we're not like seeing eye to eye and we're not working great together and I'm not able to get what I need from them, sometimes I set up regular recurring meetings with them, like say I just put it on the calendar once every other week, once a month, to just kind of like check in, see where we are. Like last time we talked, we were blocked, we weren't making progress on this. That's what the status was not last month. What's the status this month? Just to have that recurring conversation, so that it doesn't, even if the bandwidth doesn't exist today, that like you'll be able to get closure on it eventually, because you're just going to be persistent and just keep working at it basically. So yeah, that's what I would recommend. But again, like I'm not I'm up against that same sort of problem a lot of the time, and I have some techniques, but I don't have all the answers for that sort of thing.
For sure. I guess I'll ask another question. Okay. So I guess usually, when you start something new, or, in your case, your second chapter of Write the Docs, usually that comes from your experience of seeing a need in the space, right? A problem that doesn't really have a solution. Would you be comfortable in sharing a little bit of your experience and I guess why you wanted to start Write the Docs in the first place?
Yes, definitely. Well, First of all, when I first started working as a technical writer, so when I first started working as a technical writer because I had been learning web development and was like sort of just getting my feet wet in the tech industry, and was able to find this opportunity as a tech writer. But as I've kind of touched on already, tech writing and documentation tends to be sort of an under-resourced department in lots of tech organizations. And so I was in that situation, and I was the only tech writer at my organization. A lot of the time I just felt like I'm not sure how to handle certain things. And so I looked to this organization, write the docs, the resources that they have available to find direction for a lot of stuff. They have lots of conference talk recordings. They have just general like a beginner's guide to documentation on their website. And there's a Slack community that's very active. It has like over 10,000 users, and like you can get answers very quickly. They have little mini groups for like book clubs for people who are learning tech writing. So it just has so much value. It adds so much value to this industry, and it's just so welcoming to newcomers and anyone who wants to know more about documentation. And so it's just a great community, and I really wanted to develop that community locally. We're starting the chapter now when all of our meetings will be virtual, but it's still great to meet people who are local, who want to share that type of community, and eventually we can all meet in person. So, for now, virtual is the best we can do, but it's just a great community to be part of. So I definitely wanted to do my part to spread that.
Absolutely, that's great. And next questions. Any tips on how to foster collaboration between the writing team and dev teams at your org?
So I find, for me personally, as a technical writer, one great way to get better collaboration with the dev team is to, take genuine interest in who they are as people and learn more about them. Start conversations, ask about their kids. Like, I don't know. I mean, just see them as your equals and your friends to a certain extent, so that you just have a good relationship with them in general. I mean, it's much better to treat them as someone that you're working closely with throughout the entire development cycle, rather than just having like quick touch points like, oh, I need this from you now, give it to me now. Like, you haven't heard from me in weeks, but now I need something from you. So just try to try to really be align yourself with them, with the development team. That's probably the best suggestion I can make. And, as you learn more about them as people, you'll also learn more about the tools they're using, the languages that they're using, all of the work they're doing. And so take an interest in that as well.
Great answer, for sure. And I think we have time for one more question, if anyone would like to take it. I guess I'll take it. You mentioned in one of your previous answers how it's sort of under-resourced and perhaps even undervalued from what it sounds like, the documentation process. I guess, why do you think that historically, and even now possibly, has been the case, and why hasn't there been more of an emphasis on the importance of it?
I think it's really just it just has to do with incentives, and I think that in the tech industry, in many company cultures, probably rightly to a certain extent, innovation comes first. And so, I mean, that's at the top of the list of values for lots of these companies. And so they're gonna put lots of resources into innovating, and developers have an incentive to focus on code and making sure that code is produced at a certain level, and code reviews happen So ultimately, when it's release day and are we deciding whether we're ready to release or not, if there's some sort of lingering documentation issue where it's just not quite what it should be, that's not necessarily considered a ship stopping issue, whereas like a broken software product would be. So I think that's what it comes down to in many cases. But with that said, I think that there are lots of organizations that really value documentation. Like I think Stripe is a great one, and yeah, Google as well has great documentation. So yeah, there's certain organizations that are really like changing that and really setting standards for the type of resources that the documentation should have.
That's great. And you actually just took my last question. I was going to ask best practices, which companies to look at. So you mentioned Strike, you mentioned Google, and for, I guess, the audience in here wanting to learn a bit more about documentation actually put into practice, those would be the companies then to dig a little bit more into.
Yeah, I mean, Google, like, for example, has a documentation style guide that's kind of widely considered an industry standard. Stripe is also considered like the golden standard for documentation. These are kind of developer heavy docs. Not all docs are oriented to developers. So there's some good examples out there. I don't have a list offhand. I can think of one offhand, but it's just one. So yeah, I could definitely say this company called Docebo or Docebo has great docs. But that's the only one that comes to mind offhand. So definitely, if anyone wants to keep that conversation going, and and contact me, I can definitely put to some other products that have really good docs.
Great, that's perfect. And I think that's it on the time. But thank you, Ashley, for taking the time out of your weekend to come and speak at Great North Dev Fest. I'm sure everyone in the audience, and myself included, like having no tech background, I thought this was really beneficial for me too. So, and as we talked about before, for those interested in learning more about Write Docs, the Windsor Detroit chapter will actually be holding its first meeting, I believe at 7 on Monday.
Yep,
or 7 on Monday. Yeah, exactly. So I'll drop the link in the chat as well. So there will now be a 15-minute networking session before the next round of talks starts. So thank you everyone for attending, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you so much everyone for attending. I really appreciate it. And thanks, Chris.